In early July 1881, an incredible piece of news spreads like wildfire along the banks of the Nile. The mummies of ancient Egypt's greatest pharaohs are being shipped to Cairo. Among them, Ramses II and Sethos I. The people bow to these former rulers as they take their final journey. The trip turns into a triumphal procession from Luxor in Upper Egypt to Cairo. After 10 days, the procession led by German archaeologist Emil Brugsch reaches the capital. It is the final chapter of an archaeological adventure that began with a veritable tomb raid several decades ago, and then became a search for the beginnings of ancient Egypt. In the first half of the 19th century, an expedition to Egypt is only considered a success if the explorers bring home as many valuables as possible. They use every means available, even explosives. A French archaeologist, Auguste Mariette, has discovered the entrance to a tomb in Saqqara, south of Cairo, in 1851. He expects a wealth of finds. For a whole year, Mariette has tried to locate the tomb's entrance. Now, finally, the moment has arrived, and his efforts are to be rewarded. Meanwhile, the tender plant of a new scientific approach to archaeology is budding in Europe. Almost every evening, 15-year-old Heinrich Brugsch sits in the Egyptian gallery at the Royal Art Collections of Berlin, studying the mysterious hieroglyphic slabs. These inscriptions in Demotic, a cursive form of hieroglyphs, have only recently been acquired by the museum. Although Brugsch has to look after his younger brother Emil, he tirelessly copies the hieroglyphs into his notebook, page after page. The inscriptions and pictures cannot yet provide an answer to the question that fascinates everyone interested in ancient Egypt. When was the empire of the Pharaohs founded, and by whom? Would this schoolboy's knowledge of Demotic someday help to answer these questions? Years later, without ever having been to Egypt, young Brugsch is regarded as Europe's leading expert on hieroglyphs. Fieldwork, however, is still the realm of the treasure hunters. Mariette's methods are crude, but efficient. Conservation is not too high on his agenda. Egypt seems full of ancient relics. Losing an artifact or two doesn't really matter. But this time, in Saqqara, Mariette is not searching for a royal tomb. He is hunting for the sacred bull of Apis. Apis had been honored as the god of fertility since the Old Kingdom in about 3000 BC. The bull cult existed for more than 3,000 years. Even the rulers of the New Kingdom still bore the epithet powerful bull. To ancient Egyptians, Apis was an earthly representative of the world's creator. According to legend, the bulls were buried in a similar manner to the pharaohs, in huge coffins in the necropolis of Saqqara, close to the former seat of government in Memphis. When they find the first coffin, it's obvious someone has been there before them. Mariette is at a loss. There's clearly nothing here. But although the sarcophagus is empty, there is no evidence of the looting Mariette has so often observed in the pharaohs' tombs. Were the bulls and treasures reburied somewhere else, long ago, for fear of grave robbers? There are stelae attached to the walls. If there is an explanation for the reburial of the Apis bulls, it may be engraved here. Mariette has studied hieroglyphs, but he is unable to decipher these strange signs. At least no one can deny him the scientific achievement of having rediscovered the bulls' tombs. But Mariette can't properly assess his find until he has a translation of the mysterious Demotic inscriptions. It's a style of lettering which still challenges Egyptologists today. Elephantine Island is 1,000 kilometers upriver near Aswan. Here, the desert stretches almost to the banks of the Nile. The dry terrain of Upper Egypt clearly differs from the countryside in the northern parts of the country. Agriculture is a tough business here, since the fertile strip of land is so narrow. But the region around today's Aswan is of mythological significance. For the ancient Egyptians, it was the source of their country's lifeline. They called the island Abu, the elephant, perhaps because the rounded rocks reminded them of the bodies of the gray giants. But Elephantine's layers of settlements, dating back thousands of years and painstakingly excavated over the past 4 decades, have kept their secrets. To Egyptians, who even today don't think of their country as part of Africa, Elephantine marked the frontier to the Black Continent, and as such, to the ever-despised Nubians in the south. This is still the last Egyptian trading post, where goods from the Mediterranean pass on into inner Africa. For nearly 40 years, the German Archaeological Institute has been working together with the Swiss Institute for Egyptian Architectural Research, studying the settlements on Elephantine. Finds with Demotic inscriptions are a daily occurrence, but their interpretation is often too difficult for the archaeologists. Since it was impossible to construct horizontally expanding dwellings on the island, the settlements were built vertically, one layer on top of the other. A treasure trove for modern archaeologists. Artifacts from more than 4,000 years in one area.
In Elephantine, we have the singular advantage of being certain that we are finding large amounts of written documents in context, in people's homes. That is an opportunity Brugsch almost never had back then. He mainly had to rely on papyrus stocks from the museums or the art trade here in Egypt.
Heinrich Brugsch finally arrives in Cairo in 1853, a specialist in the field of old scripts, but a novice in Egypt. The King of Prussia, Frederick William IV, has given Brugsch letters of recommendation, but unfortunately, his financial support only amounts to 1,500 thalers, a modest endowment, especially considering that the price of Egyptian antiques has enormously increased. The growing European interest has not escaped the shrewd Arab traders. Immediately after Napoleon's Egyptian expedition in 1801, the Bavarian and Prussian kings started buying nearly everything that came out of the historical sites, even the inscriptions on ancient papyri, which no one could read at the beginning of the 19th century. For Brugsch, those papyri represent the only possibility of furthering his Demotic studies.
Hey, monsieur, 50 زي بعضه. شكرا. Merci.
Just as 150 years ago, many Egyptian antiquities still leave the country via dubious channels. Supreme Council of Antiquities in Cairo has created an entire department to fight the international art trade mafia, who offers articles for sale through auction houses.
If you need to excavate, you have to follow these rules. And this to show that if you are the guardian of the monuments that belong to the world, you have to be very strict. And I am very strict with everyone.
Hawas's team is uncovering the burial site of Pharaoh Teti, who ruled Egypt 4,300 years ago and is said to have been killed by his own bodyguards. But even from this recently discovered site, a number of artifacts have already been stolen.
Egypt, I think, never have a strategy before to stop the theft and to stop all this smuggling out of Egypt. We have what really called the rape of the Nile. The Nile was completely raped by many people, adventurers and smugglers who came and they entered in tombs and they cut the reliefs and they they even entered inside the storage magazines and they take statues. Saqqara is an example of that. Over like maybe 5 store magazines, they dug underneath and they took many artifacts, and we heard about this great theft that some English people and Egyptians together and Americans, they took and they smuggled many monuments from this place.
The archaeological treasures are stored in Saqqara's excavation house. Guards make sure that only those in charge of the excavation are allowed to enter the storage rooms, since it is extremely tempting for the poorly paid laborers to sell a find to dealers. Tightened security measures and stricter regulations are making it more difficult for black market traders to get their hands on ancient finds. But that also means that prices for artifacts will rise. Supply and demand is the name of the game on the antiques black market, too. The highest prices are paid for gilded statues or intact coffins, like this coffin of a high-ranking government official who was buried in Saqqara in the year 100 BC. The coffin was discovered in one of the shaft graves at the necropolis, which can be up to 6 meters deep. Over thousands of years, they were used and reused, as were graves in general. Quite a few discoveries have already been made here, and there are new finds in every excavation season. The Secretary General of the Antiquities Council is certain that Saqqara has even more to reveal. And this time, Egyptian archaeologists want to be in charge.
Saqqara was a place that many foreigners excavated here. Mariette, the German, the Japanese, and I really wanted to have an expedition by our name as Egyptian to compete with all of these people. And I was succeeded really in hiring young Egyptian. Since I don't have time now, I come sometimes to the work, but the young people here are doing a very impressive work, and the discoveries that we made are really known everywhere now.
Egypt is reclaiming its historical roots, but the groundwork was laid 150 years ago. After several months, Mariette has to accept that he needs the help of others to interpret the inscriptions in the Serapeum. He asks Heinrich Brugsch, even though Brugsch has never taken part in a single dig. The Frenchman hardly leaves Brugsch time to unpack. He puts him to work right away. Although Mariette prefers wielding a spade to studying texts, he has heard a lot about Brugsch. The new arrival is anxious to put his knowledge of Demotic script to the test. He immediately realizes that the signs in the Serapeum tell a completely different story from anything he has translated up until then. They do mention the Apis bulls, But instead of finding evidence of the location of the burial objects, Brugsch discovers something else, something much more important. The first clue to the chronology of the Pharaoh's empire. Because every bull is assigned to a specific pharaoh. By determining the bull's dates of birth and death, Brugsch is able to reconstruct the reign of each individual ruler and establish a line of ancestry that has evaded every scholar before him. Now that he has found the key to deciphering and arranging the tablets in chronological order, linking each bull with his specific pharaoh, Brugsch is certain he can descend the ladder of time to the very beginnings of ancient Egypt. Mariette at once understands the significance of this discovery. It is the first indisputable basis for the history and chronology of the Egyptian Empire. Like many scholars, Mariette too had wondered which king had founded this amazing empire. And when the cornerstone was laid for a kingdom that outshone all its rivals. In 1883, the estimates of scholars differed by thousands of years, and there was a good reason for that. Like the chronologies of most ancient peoples, the Egyptians didn't have a single fixed point from which to record time. With every new ruler, they began counting the years afresh. In 1864, another chronology was found, the famous Abydos king list. For Brugsch and Mariette, this was additional evidence, because the list depicts 75 pharaohs with their names framed by ovals, known as cartouches. The earliest cartouche names Pharaoh Menes, who ruled in 2955 BC. But was Menes actually the first pharaoh? Modern scholars are only gradually approaching the beginnings of ancient Egypt. And today, they know that Menes was not the first ruler, but who ruled before him. Egyptologist Gunther Dreyer is the director of the German Archaeological Institute in Cairo. He has been working in Egypt for over 30 years, but his most recent discoveries have been the most spectacular.
Diese Funde waren schon sehr überraschend und man kann sie schon fast sensationell nennen.
The finds were really surprising. You could almost say sensational, because we never expected we would find written documents and sources that could tell us something about that period. In that sense, there's a lot of good news. We're learning something about a period no one really knew anything about. We can now say written scripts existed much earlier than we had suspected, and that expands our historical horizon. This way, we're able to track the development and roots of Egyptian high culture, step by step.
In Abydos, Gunther Dreyer went in search of the dynasty that scholars call Zero. He discovered graves that are at least 150, if not 200 years older than the first dynasty of Menes. A hooked staff made of ivory was found, over 5,000 years old, and resembling a king's scepter. Perhaps it belonged to the first ruler of Dynasty Zero. On one of the vessels that were found, the sign of a scorpion is clearly visible. And this is what we call the first ruler, King Scorpion. Abydos is a milestone for Egyptology in its search for the roots of Egypt's high culture.
Thanks to these discoveries, we can retrace the historical development about 200 years further back into the past. What existed before the Imperial Union? There was a partial empire in Upper Egypt, which gradually expanded to all of Egypt. In this way, we've been able to push back the dividing line between prehistory and history by about 200 years.
Having grasped the significance of the line of ancestors, Mariette changes his way of working. The crude excavator turns into a serious archaeologist, and Heinrich Brugsch is promoted to be his closest confidant. After years of digging, Mariette has collected enough artifacts to fill a museum. It opens in Cairo in 1858, the predecessor of today's world-famous Egyptian museum. Mariette is on good terms with the Egyptian ruler, Khedive Mohammed Said. For the Khedive, antiquities are good PR for his country. He appoints Mariette the first director of the museum and raises him to the rank of Pasha. Thus ennobled, Mariette Pasha founds Egypt's first Council of Antiquities. In a separate gallery, Mariette reserves a place of honor for the greatest of all pharaohs, Ramses II. But despite enormous efforts, Mariette and Brugsch have not yet found his coffin. Following its move from a suburb, the Egyptian Museum is now located in the center of Cairo. Thousands of artifacts were lost during a flood in the old museum. So Mariette persuaded the Khedive to build impressive new galleries to house the exhibition safely forever. The museum now contains 1.5 million artifacts. It is the world's largest collection of ancient Egyptian art, with works from many different eras of Egypt's 5,000-year history. The rooms on the upper floors were already overflowing at the beginning of the 20th century. Newly delivered pieces had to be stored in the basement, often aimlessly and without any notes about the place they were found. Every semblance of order was lost. For a long time, nobody knew what exactly was locked away in the 3,000 square meters of vaults. Until a woman took over as director of the museum in 2004. Wafa El-Sadiq instructed her staff to make a thorough inventory.
I'm sure we will fill some of the gaps in the ancient Egyptian history, because all the finds we have here are from archaeologists who discovered many places in Egypt over 140 years, and you can imagine what we have here in this basement and what's still to be discovered here.
Whenever new artifacts are discovered, the museum's own conservation lab moves into action. 6 archaeologists have spent months combing through these underground treasure chambers. Every new coffin could be a king's. Many objects thought to be lost have been rediscovered in the museum's own basement. The director estimates that her staff will need another 2 years to put together a complete inventory. 6,000 coffins and 2,000 pots have been identified so far. Despite meticulous reconstruction, in some cases nobody knows where the finds come from or how they fit into over 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian history. The artifacts are categorized as accurately as possible, though the descriptions are sometimes not too helpful. This one is simply filed as Big Mask of a Coffin. Some of the finds that were delivered here will never be found, because 150 years ago, the basement of the museum was a place for shady dealings. Back then, the mummies represented a lucrative extra income for the museum's staff. Emil, Heinrich's brother, is the new conservator, and he starts doing profitable deals, selling mummies. Museums and wealthy customers in Europe and the USA have been receiving deliveries directly from the museum's basement, until it becomes too much for the director. Mariette has turned a blind eye for a long time. After all, Emil Brugsch is his good friend's brother. But enough is enough. Mariette cleans house. That doesn't necessarily make him more popular with the Egyptian black marketeers, but something had to be done. As for Emil Brugsch, his days as conservator are over, but the director is willing to give him a second chance. During the next 2 years, Mariette trains Emil Brugsch to become his scientific assistant. It is only then that he takes him to the Valley of the Kings. The head of Egyptian antiquities has expanded his scope of activities. He dedicates his entire energy to the search for the elusive mummy of Ramses II. Mariette is obsessed with discovering the sarcophagus of the most powerful pharaoh of all time. Ramses' tomb had already been discovered long before, but it was empty. Yet more and more burial objects kept surfacing on the black market. That allows for only one conclusion. Grave robbers have actually found Ramses' final resting place. Mariette assumes that Ramses' coffin must still be somewhere in the Valley of the Kings. But where? Mariette cannot know that the priests of the God King took their pharaoh out of the Valley of the Kings thousands of years before. Ramses' eternal peace, like that of so many other rulers, had lasted only a few years. Then the robbers had come, stealing the gold, but leaving the coffins behind. In order to save them for posterity, the loyal priests, around 1000 BC, hid the mummies. The pharaohs left the sacred Valley of the Kings. Today there is no more danger of looting in the Valley of the Kings. Night watchmen protect every chamber. But now, the world's most famous tombs face a new threat. The scientists of the Theban Mapping Project were the first to notice. The humidity and temperatures in the burial chambers have dramatically changed in the past few years because of the tourists for whom the gates are opened at dawn. Every new busload brings heat and humidity. 8,000 visitors a day surge through the passageways. Archaeologist Kent Weeks founded the Theban Mapping Project to save the tombs. He has discovered a tomb with 120 chambers in the Valley of the Kings. Now he's committed to the preservation of this impressive necropolis. Every morning and every evening, his team measures the humidity. On an average day, it is 20% in the morning. But when the tourists leave the vaults in the evening, it reaches 85%. The desert climate preserved the sealed-off tombs for thousands of years. Now they are suddenly threatened with destruction.
What would happen is that the plaster on the walls would soften and begin to flake off. The pigments would change, the paint would begin to deteriorate, and eventually the structural stability of the tomb would be affected, and pillars and columns could weaken to the point that you'd begin to get ceiling collapse.
To prevent the worst, the biggest holes in the intricately adorned walls were simply plastered over. This was treating the symptoms. Many tombs were temporarily closed to the public. But it isn't only the changing humidity that adversely affects the tombs.
We have people really very careful about the monuments, and they never touch or taking photos. But some of them, they are careless. I mean, they're trying to touch or to feel the figures, or trying to to taste the color if it's new or it's come in his finger, and so on.
Kent Weeks and his team want to work on the causes. Weeks has established a rotation system that determines when chambers are open to the public.
57 is also going to be one of the few tombs that are closed.
At the same time, he is preparing for the day when none of the tombs may be accessible anymore. He is working on a virtual tour of the Valley of the Kings. He wants to make it accessible to everyone on the internet, with interactive tours of the tombs. So that the Pharaoh's eternal peace can be preserved.
I don't think an ancient pharaoh for a moment thought that there would be 8,000 people visiting his tomb every day for an eternity. The tomb was not designed to be visited by any except the spirit of the pharaoh and of the gods with whom he was to be associated. It was meant to be a sealed environment and left untouched. We are intruders in this environment, and obviously no one ever planned for this. No one ever thought the tourists would come in such numbers.
Kent Weeks' office is a boat. Within sight of the ancient temples, he is developing a master plan on behalf of the Egyptian Council of Antiquities. He's trying to determine the critical number of tourists which the Valley of the Kings can tolerate before it suffers further damage. Weeks has become a consultant. Excavation plans have grown into business plans.
Any archaeologist, whether he's working in Mexico or Guatemala or Paris or Istanbul or wherever, has to raise funds for his project. And it becomes increasingly difficult to do so because of increasing demands. Archaeology is very labor intensive, it's very expensive, increasingly so as new techniques and new technology are developed. I think probably an archaeologist spends almost as much time fundraising today as he does actually working in the field.
Archaeology has created jobs for tens of thousands in Upper Egypt. Most of the residents of the green strip along the Nile work directly or indirectly for the tourist trade. There is more construction near the historical sites than anywhere else. Archaeology prepared the ground for the stampede of visitors. Every year, tourists pour over 7 billion euros into Egypt's economy. The government understandably does everything it can to encourage the cult of Egypt's ancestors. Thus, Ramses II has another great royal ceremony, over 3,000 years after his brilliant reign. It's actually only the transport of a statue, but it turns into a public celebration, a fan mile for a pharaoh. A huge truck is modified to haul the god king away from the smog of the capital and out to one of Cairo's suburbs. Ramses still captivates the masses, just as he did 150 years ago. Marietta spent 30 years digging and exploring in Egypt. In his final years, he is obsessed with finding Ramses' mummy. He has defied the extreme climate, gangs of thieves, and physical assaults. But he is powerless. against diabetes. Heinrich and Emil Brugsch know their mentor's weakening. On their last visit, they bring him good news, sensational news. The Egyptian police have stumbled upon a hitherto undetected grave. It's believed to be near Luxor, outside the Valley of the Kings. And everything the brothers have heard so far points to a royal tomb. Mariette is too weak to go there himself. Heinrich Brugsch has to return to Berlin, so it is left to his brother Emil to take care of the new find. Finish what I am no longer able to do, Mariette tells Emil. Do it for me. Find Ramses. Emil Brugsch hurries to Luxor. There's no time to lose. Word about newly discovered royal tombs travels fast. Have the police really hit the jackpot? According to the police report, the hiding place for the tomb, the so-called royal cachette, is a few kilometers south of the Valley of the Kings. Members of the Rasul family, a notorious gang of tomb raiders, lead Emil to the spot. Is it a trap? Or is this inconspicuous hole really the final resting place for the greatest of all the pharaohs? Generations of Rasuls have lived by selling looted burial objects. Their knowledge of the chamber's location is an asset which is passed from one generation to the next, to the present day. The descendants of the Rasuls still live in Kurna, the legendary village of tomb raiders. And they still look for royal tombs. But today, they do it officially, in association with the German Archaeological Institute in Dra Abu El Naga, a necropolis just a few kilometers away from the Valley of the Kings. The Institute has been exploring the huge cemetery since 1991. One of the goals of Daniel Poltz, who heads the excavation project, is to discover more about the transition period between the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, known as the Second Intermediate Period of Egypt, around 1600 BC.
By studying the Second Intermediate, we are dealing with the era that led to the high point of ancient Egypt's prosperity, the New Kingdom. That's why we are interested in this era, because it led to the creation of a kind of state structure which is hardly seen anywhere else in the ancient world.
From Dra Abu El Naga, the rulers had a good view of the most important cemeteries in Thebes. It is the only necropolis within sight of the vast plain with the sacred sites of Karnak on the other side of the Nile. Thus, the necropolis benefited from the sacred status of Karnak. Mariette was sure that Dra Abu El Naga had to be a very special cemetery.
Mariette hat als erster versucht, das Ganze ein bisschen zu systematisieren.
Mariette was the first person to try to systemize the whole thing, and he also used ancient Egyptian sources and clues to find the burial sites of kings, which is amazing and relatively modern. He followed up on local information, here on site in Luxor, and tried to use ancient Egyptian sources as a map, so to speak, to find certain tombs. Now that is a relatively modern way of conducting archaeological research.
Poltz is following in the footsteps of Mariette, who searched for royal tombs here as early as 1870, without results. Then, as now, archaeologists' appetites are whetted by a find which has been exhibited in the British Museum since 1830. The gilded coffin of Pharaoh Nuptcheperre, a ruler of the Second Intermediate, from Dra Abu El Naga. But information about the burial chamber's whereabouts was not passed on, so Poltz started to look for clues that had already guided Mariette.
Ausgangspunkt für Mariette war ein
Mariette's
Papyrus.
point of departure was a papyrus also stored at the British Museum. It described fairly precisely where the king's tomb group was located.
The Abbot Papyrus is the antique report of a commission which investigated damages to the royal tombs in 1115 BC. In that report, it says that the tombs are located very close to a pyramid. Pultz identified this place as the location where the specified pyramid once stood. He also discovered that there are deep shafts underneath the pyramid. The underground shafts go down as far as 10 meters, but the shafts that have been investigated harbor no royal tombs. The empty, plundered coffin the archaeologists found belongs to a group of private tombs for a senior official in the administration. The search for the pharaohs buried in Dra Abu el Naga goes on. Pultz is driven by the hope that looters or early archaeologists at least left the scientific treasures behind.
Many of the things that don't interest tomb raiders are interesting to us, and vice versa. We are less interested in finding pieces of jewelry or gold or any kind of precious metal. We are out to find meaningful remains of funeral furnishings.
The greatest finds in Dra Abu el Naga are probably made in secret, unknown to archaeologists. Many homes in Kuna are said to be built on undiscovered tombs, with shafts several hundred meters long, leading from the basements up into the hills. But a new law is designed to put an end to that kind of scheme. Some 3,000 families are being resettled. Soon these homes will no longer be here, and archaeologists will be able to enter the basements and perhaps come back with a surprise or two, provided the most important finds haven't already been stashed away somewhere. On July 6, 1881, Emil Brugsch is on the verge of a remarkable discovery. In a shaft which could possibly lead him to the immortal pharaoh. This moment could confer immortality on Brugsch himself. The first meters leave no doubt the shaft is indeed a hiding place for tombs. Coffins are lying crisscross in a cave-like room. Burial objects are strewn everywhere. Robbers seem to have helped themselves over the millennia. The final resting place for ancient Egypt's greatest rulers. Emil Brugsch finds 36 coffins in the royal cachette, including those of Thutmose III, Sethos I, and Ramses II. In his notes, he shows he is aware of the significance of his success. I am proud that I, as a German, have had the good fortune to accompany the ancient pharaohs to Cairo, where they will be given a place of honor at the museum there. This sacred river has rarely carried a more noble cargo. On July 14, 1881, Emil Brugsch sails down the Nile with his precious find. For fear of thieves, Brugsch has insisted the matter be dealt with in an absolutely confidential manner. But word gets around the entire country that the great pharaohs are on their way to the capital. The people humbly pay their respects to their former rulers, even in the streets of Cairo. Auguste Mariette doesn't live to witness his assistant's triumph. Today, the likeness of Mariette, chiseled in stone, stands guard for Ramses II in front of the Egyptian Museum. The pharaoh's mummy has been given a place of honor. His mortal remains have been rescued from oblivion. But instead of lying in eternal rest, he is now exposed to the eyes of the world. The discovery of the mummy of Egypt's mightiest ruler is symbolic of the way a science evolves. Archaeologists rescue historical knowledge from tomb raiders, and the fog surrounding the beginnings of ancient Egypt begins to clear.
Stay with H2 for more mysteries of Egypt right through this Sunday. After the break, one of history's great disappearing acts as Ramesses II's impressive metropolis goes AWOL. Lost Cities of the Ancients goes in search of the vanished capital of the pharaoh next.